John Lennon, one of the most iconic voices in music history, has often been remembered for his genius, wit, and unapologetic honesty, but he was also a man who carried deep frustrations and complex emotions, particularly in his relationships with his fellow Beatles, especially Paul McCartney. While the world often romanticizes the Beatles as four inseparable friends creating music that changed the world, John's reflections reveal a far more complicated reality, filled with rivalry, tension, and personal clashes that defined both the band's creative highs and its eventual unraveling. John often spoke candidly about the musical and personal competition with Paul, acknowledging that it was impossible to separate their friendship from the pressures of fame, creative ambition, and differing personalities. He recalls that from the earliest days of songwriting, Paul and he were constantly comparing ideas, melodies, and lyrics, sometimes collaborating seamlessly and other times sparking friction that could last for hours or days. The public narrative of a harmonious partnership, John insisted, glossed over the reality that beneath the polished performances and hit records were four strong-willed individuals negotiating dominance, artistic direction, and recognition, each with their own vision for what the band could be. John admitted that rivalry with Paul often pushed him to write better songs, to innovate, and to challenge himself creatively, but it also fueled resentment when compromises were demanded or when he felt overshadowed. He recalls that arguments could begin over something as small as a chord progression or lyric choice, yet escalate into personal confrontations, with both he and Paul stubbornly defending their positions. These rivalries were compounded by differing approaches to music and life. Paul's meticulous attention to harmony, melody, and public image often clashed with John's raw energy, experimental impulses, and desire for authenticity at any cost. John recognized that these differences were both a source of their greatest achievements and their deepest conflicts, with songs like A Day in the Life and Strawberry Fields Forever born from moments of tension and negotiation, yet sometimes leaving lingering bitterness behind the scenes. Beyond the Paul-John dynamic, John reflected on rivalries within the band more broadly, noting that George Harrison and Ringo Starr each had their own struggles asserting themselves creatively. George, John recalled, often felt constrained by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting dominance, yearning to contribute more significantly while navigating the hierarchical dynamics that had emerged over the years. Ringo, while beloved by the others, was frequently caught in the middle, sometimes frustrated by disagreements yet always acting as the stabilizing presence during moments of turmoil. John remembered vividly that some of the band's most difficult periods occurred during recording sessions, when personal tensions collided with artistic ambition. He described evenings in the studio where arguments over arrangements or vocals would dominate the atmosphere, leaving creativity overshadowed by ego and stubbornness. At times, these rivalries spilled into public perception, as interviews, press coverage, and fan speculation amplified even minor disagreements into sensationalized narratives, making it harder for the band members to separate private frustrations from public scrutiny. John admitted that while he often reacted impulsively and expressed his emotions bluntly, he also understood that Paul's behavior, his careful crafting of melodies, insistence on control in certain sessions, was rooted in his own insecurities and desire to maintain the band's excellence. Despite the clashes, John often emphasized that rivalry did not equate to hatred. There was a foundation of deep respect, even if it was frequently overshadowed by personal ego and frustration. He reflected on how their dynamic shaped some of the Beatles' most groundbreaking work, noting that creative tension can act as a catalyst for innovation, forcing each musician to push beyond comfort zones and explore new musical landscapes. Yet John was also painfully aware of the emotional toll this constant rivalry exacted. The pressures of global fame, combined with artistic disputes, sometimes led to profound isolation, moments when John felt misunderstood, unappreciated, or even trapped within the very band that had given him unparalleled success. He recounted nights where he questioned whether the group could survive the mounting personal and professional pressures, and he admitted to times when he considered stepping away entirely to pursue music on his own terms. Reflecting on specific incidents, John recalled the recording of the White Album as a particularly fraught period, where disagreements with Paul over song arrangements, vocal responsibilities, and creative direction created tension that reverberated throughout the sessions. He remembered George's frustration with limited input, Ringo temporarily leaving the studio over a minor dispute, and the general atmosphere of exhaustion and emotional strain that seemed to permeate every interaction. In John's words, the band was at once a collaborative powerhouse and a pressure cooker, capable of producing some of the most innovative music in history while simultaneously fostering conflict that threatened to tear them apart. John also reflected on the role of Yoko Ono, acknowledging that her presence and influence on John's life sometimes intensified the public perception of conflict, particularly between him and Paul. He insisted, however, that much of the tension attributed solely to Yoko was actually rooted in long-standing differences between him and Paul, and in the growing pains of a band navigating unprecedented fame. According to John, understanding the feud with Paul requires seeing it not as a simple story of personal animosity, but as the product of intertwined factors: artistic ambition, differing personalities, media scrutiny, and the pressures of living and working in one of the most scrutinized bands in history. Over time, John recognized that these rivalries shaped not only their music but also his personal growth, teaching him lessons in collaboration, compromise, and self-awareness. He spoke candidly about regrets, acknowledging moments where his bluntness or impatience may have caused unnecessary friction, yet he also celebrated the ways in which the band's internal dynamics pushed them to new creative heights. John noted that even after the Beatles officially disbanded, the echoes of these rivalries persisted in interviews, reunions, discussions, and public memory, reminding him of both the joy and difficulty inherent in such an intense collaboration. He reflected on how, despite conflicts, the mutual respect and shared history with Paul ultimately endured, informing their occasional post-Beatles interactions and collaborations. John's reflections paint a picture of a man aware of the complexity of human relationships, one who understood that rivalry, while challenging, can be a driving force behind artistic achievement. He acknowledged that love, friendship, ambition, and ego were all intertwined in ways that made the Beatles' story far richer, and far more complicated, than the public narrative often suggests. Through decades of hindsight, John emphasized that the feud with Paul and rivalries within the band should be seen as integral to their legacy. They were a group of extraordinary talents, navigating fame, creative pressure, and human emotion, creating music that continues to resonate worldwide. Ultimately, John's perspective reminds us that even legends are not immune to conflict, that artistic brilliance often comes with personal cost, and that understanding the human side of musical icons requires looking beyond simplified narratives to the nuanced realities of their experiences. His reflections offer insight into the emotional and psychological dynamics that shaped the Beatles' journey, providing fans with a deeper understanding of the rivalries, tensions, and personal struggles that fueled both their greatest triumphs and their most painful moments, revealing a story as complex and human as the music itself, and other times sparking friction that could last for hours or days. The public narrative of a harmonious partnership, John insisted, glossed over the reality that beneath the polished performances and hit records were four strong-willed individuals negotiating dominance, artistic direction, and recognition, each with their own vision for what the band could be. John admitted that rivalry with Paul often pushed him to write better songs, to innovate, and to challenge himself creatively, but it also fueled resentment when compromises were demanded or when he felt overshadowed. He recalls that arguments could begin over something as small as a chord progression or lyric choice, yet escalate into personal confrontations, with both he and Paul stubbornly defending their positions. These rivalries were compounded by differing approaches to music and life. Paul's meticulous attention to harmony, melody, and public image often clashed with John's raw energy, experimental impulses, and desire for authenticity at any cost. John recognized that these differences were both a source of their greatest achievements and their deepest conflicts, with songs like A Day in the Life